One of the most popular characters and iconic Celeron hunters has just released, and it's Kafka. Today we'll be going over Kafka's kit, how to play her, build suggestions, and much more. Without further ado, let's get straight into it. Kafka has quite a unique kit as she approaches damage over time in a brand new way with her skill kit. Her skill allows her to deal damage to an enemy and adjacent enemies, but when an enemy has damage over time inflicted onto them, either from Kafka's DoT she can inflict or in allies, this will result in massive damage from her skill. Without damage over time inflicted onto the enemy, her skill can still do damage. However, the detonation that Kafka's skill does is what allows her to do a hefty amount of damage with her skill. Kafka's follow-up attack and ultimate also has a 100% base chance to shock enemies, which is a nice way for Kafka to inflict damage over time without needing to rely on another ally to inflict it for her skill to do more damage. Kafka's follow-up attacks trigger once per turn, and they occur when an ally uses a basic attack. And Kafka's ultimate attacks all enemies and is her iconic attack, which I'm sure many of us have seen and love. And this also can deal a good amount of damage as well. Kafka's technique deals lightning damage to all enemies and also has a base chance, which is also 100% to shock enemies. As for her traces, they're quite useful as well. Her mini traces allow her to increase her attack, effect hit rate, and max HP. As for her main traces, when the ultimate is used, enemy targets will now receive damage immediately from all currently applied DoT sources instead of just receiving damage immediately from the currently applied shock state. This is a really powerful trace as well to take advantage of the DoT that is inflicted onto enemies from Kafka herself and other teammates. Her next trace allows her to regain energy when an enemy is defeated with shock inflicted onto them, and her final trace allows her base chance to inflict shock to be increased from her technique, ultimate, and follow-up attacks by 30%. Overall, her traces are quite useful and definitely allow for her damaging potential and utility to improve. Now that we've gone over Kafka's kit, let's go over her playstyle. There are a few ways to go about playing Kafka, which can result in you using a mix of other damage over time users, buffers, debuffers, and so on to support Kafka's kit. Kafka can ideally be the main DPS on your team, and with that in mind, you'll want to ensure damage over time is inflicted onto enemies at a very consistent rate to deal a lot of damage with her skill kit. A few ways to do this is speed tuning your team, where another damage over time user is faster than Kafka, so that they can inflict their own form of DoT onto enemies, which can be burn, wind shear, bleed, and so on. And Kafka will then attack with her skill and her other attacks, such as her ultimate and so on, and be able to detonate the damage over time inflicted onto enemies consistently, at least with her skill. Another way to inflict damage over time onto enemies without another character who inflicts it is by having her use her ultimate quite often, taking advantage of her follow-up attacks each turn, and also using her technique at the start of battle. This can be a bit difficult to upkeep with her shock depending on how smooth your rotations are, but it is definitely another possibility I thought I'd mention. And keep in mind, of course, that the shock from the ultimate, follow-up attacks, and technique will last for 2 enemy turns. For a possible rotation with the first idea in mind, you'd want a damage over time user, then a buffer or debuffer if you are using one, then Kafka, and then a sustain in order to ensure damage over time is inflicted onto the enemy, and then also if you do have a buffer to buff Kafka, or the debuffer to debuff the enemies before she attacks for far more damaging potential. Kafka doesn't necessarily need to be slow though to make this work, rather you'd want your teammates to be fast. Let's say Kafka has 134 speed, you'd ideally want your other DoT characters to have a higher speed than 134, as well as your buffer or debuffer, so that Kafka can take advantage of this. As for the other idea, you'd want to attempt to use Kafka's ultimate before using her skill to attempt to place shock onto the enemy if shock is not already inflicted onto them, and of course if you do not have another DoT user on the team. So when Kafka does use her skills, she'll still be able to detonate her own shock, and also having a buffer or debuffer faster is beneficial to possibly use a basic attack if need be, so that Kafka can trigger her follow-up attacks for more damaging potential and also the possibility to shock the enemy. Just as a note to keep in mind, Kafka will be skill point hungry due to wanting to deal as much damage as possible with her detonation through her skill. So this will be a thing to keep in mind when team building, which I will go over later. Now that we've gone over how to play Kafka, let's go over builds to make your Kafka dominate the battle. Get it? Since she dominates you in simulated universe? Okay, let's just move on. For Kafka's relics, I don't honestly have too many suggestions since I found the Sizzling Thunder set and Space Sailing set to be quite ideal because of what they provide for her. The Space set increases her attack by up to 24%, and the Sizzling Thunder set increases her lightning damage with a 2-piece, and the 4-piece allows her attack to be increased after using her skill, which can allow her to buff up her skills as well. You can also use a set such as the Musketeer set for the extra speed and attack percentage. However, I would recommend Sizzling Thunder definitely for the higher damage output. Another thing to keep in mind is that damage over time does not crit, so as a result, you don't really need crit rate and crit damage on Kafka. From my own testing, other attacks separated from damage over time can possibly crit as shown here. However, it would be more beneficial to stack attack instead, and as a result, you'll want attack and speed as your priority stat. For main stats, you'll want attack percent body, speed or attack boots. I would personally recommend speed so that you can attack more often within turns, due to damage over time lasting on the enemy's turns rather than Kafka's. So Kafka being faster can allow her to detonate as much as possible before the damage over time currently inflicted onto the enemy goes away. You'll want a lightning damaging sphere ideally, but if you don't have one, I'd go with attack until you have a lightning sphere. And I would recommend attack rope personally. You can do break if you want a break and attack hybrid build, but I personally prefer attack overall, but break is definitely a possibility as well if you intend to break often with Kafka. As for substats, you'll also want to prioritize attack and speed, which I'd recommend roughly around the 134 range as a basis. If you want to go higher, there's nothing wrong with that, but I would try to aim for that if possible as a starting point. With Kafka's mini traces for effect hit rate and her final ascension trace, she will not need effect hit rate substats since she will have a 100% chance to inflict shock onto enemies. As for light cones, you can use her signature light cone for best damaging potential as it increases her damage dealt by 24%, increases her speed by 4.8% each time she attacks, which stacks up to 3 times, and as a result, effectively gives 14.4% speed increase, and also inflicts erode. I believe I pronounced that correctly. This counts as a damage over time, and this is inflicted if the enemy is not currently inflicted by it, and will also receive 60% of the wearer's attack as lightning damage over time for 1 turn. Her light cone allows her to inflict damage over time far more consistently onto enemies and allows her to detonate way more often without having to rely on the uptime, I suppose, of her ultimate and other teammates to inflict shock onto enemies. Of course though, with all of her traces, since her base chance will be 100%, I wouldn't have to worry too much about uptime, but the light cone effect of erode is still nice to consider overall when you are playing her. As for alternative choices, I'd recommend Good Night Sleep Well, as this light cone is amazing for DPS output on Nihility characters, as you can effectively get a 36% damage increase at only S1. For Menta can be a nice option as well for free to play, as it allows you to have increased break effect and increasing damage dealt to enemies with shock or wind shear inflicted onto them, which can be useful when Kafka shocks enemies, or if you use Sampo and he inflicts wind shear onto enemies for additional damage output. You can also use Welt's Light Cone for additional damage dealt to enemies who are debuffed, and also have additional skill damage with an attack increase. Now that we've gone over how to build Kafka, let's go over team comps and concepts. As for team comps, one of Kafka's best partners is Sampo, due to his ability to inflict wind shear consistently and often on numerous enemies, increasing DoT taken by enemies from his ultimate, and so on. Tingyun and Asta are also great partners, but I would recommend Tingyun more as Kafka's ideal buffer due to the attack increase, lightning damage increase, and energy alongside damage increases given from Tingyun's ultimate. For debuffers, I recommend Silverwolf and Pela the most due to defense decreases, as defense decreases can definitely assist with DoT doing more damage. And Silverwolf also reducing enemy resistances as well can be pretty good. For sustained characters, I personally had better experiences with a healer rather than a shielder, but either can work. With Silverwolf, you can do a lightning team of Bailu, Tingyun, Silverwolf, and Kafka. And if you want to use another damage over time user, I'd recommend using Kafka, Tingyun, damage over time user, and sustain. Ultimately comes down to which characters you have and being able to have the upkeep on damage over time inflicted onto enemies and how you intend to use her, as mentioned earlier in the video. Personally, I had the best experiences with characters like Sampo and Tingyun, which is why I highly recommend using them. But of course, you can use other damage over time users, such as Himiko, Luca, and so on. I just personally think Sampo is the most fitting though because of his ability to increase damage over time taken by enemies through his ultimate. Now let's go over Kafka's Eidolons and my personal thoughts on her. I personally think Kafka is really good and fine at E0 as her kit feels complete on a basis level, but getting copies of her can allow for better team supportive capabilities with E2 for instance, and also increase her damage output with E1, E4, and especially E6, as E6 will increase her damage output by quite a lot. If I were to recommend a stopping point, I would probably recommend E1 or E2 depending on what you're going for. E2 is pretty good once again for helping out the whole team at that point, but if you are just more so looking at improving your Kafka, but if I were to once again be pretty honest about it, I think E0 is pretty good overall. Now I thought I'd give another personal thought, which is I think Kafka is a great character. The only issue I can see holding her back though is that it feels like there isn't enough characters, or rather there isn't characters currently that allow her to be at her full maximum potential just yet regarding damage over time and her enhanced playstyle, at least in my opinion. I do feel like she is going to be very good for long-term investment, since it's likely that the next damage over time oriented characters will fit very nicely with her. She does great damage even with our current roster, but I do feel like future characters will also be able to continue to improve her damage and her potential overall as time goes on. That'll be all for my guide on our third seller on Hunter Kafka, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know how you guys plan to use Kafka and what team comps you have in mind. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more Star Rail content, leave a like to support the video, and like always, I hope you all have a nice one. Peace.